We're really excited today to be presenting some important information about traumatic brain injuries, thanks to the wonderful research that Rachel Ramirez has been doing over at the Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury through the Ohio Domestic Violence Network. Hi, Rachel. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to go through some housekeeping items so we can understand what we'll be doing today, and then turn it over to Rachel. All right, first off, as I mentioned in the chat, all attendees will be in listen-only mode throughout the entire presentation. If you have a question, I'll be monitoring the Q&A section. You can use the chat to communicate with other attendees and maybe alert us if any issues come up with the webinar. That way we can quickly address those. We will be sending out certificates of attendance and a recording, as well as if there's any resources that come up in the presentation, we'll send those out within the next week. If you are a call-in listener, please do email me at ashley@domesticshelters.org, just so that way I have your email address, because otherwise I will not have an email address to send that information. All right, and just a little bit I wanted to cover about who domesticshelters.org is. Most of you should be pretty familiar with it, but maybe if you heard about this through the grapevine, I want to make sure you understand who we are and what we do. So we are the fastest growing online resource for domestic violence information and resources. We help over 2 million people each year find the answers they need about domestic violence, whether that be victims, survivors, advocates, concerned citizens, etc. We have a searchable database of over 2,800 domestic violence programs in the US and Canada. And if you are a domestic violence service provider and you're not sure if your organization is listed, you can go to the website, obviously, and search, or just send me an email at that email address below. And just a reminder that US shelters can set up a free wish list, which allows donors from anywhere in the world to ship items directly to your shelter. And then just one more note I want to make sure everyone's aware of. We're really excited. Beginning January 1st of next year, we are officially launching our Purple Ribbon Award program. So you can learn more at the website, domesticshelters.org/awards, or visit purpleribbon.awards.org. But basically it's a national awards program, or actually really a global awards program. Anyone in the world can nominate someone, and we really want to just recognize the heroes and allies of the domestic violence movement. And we will be giving out up to $30,000 in grants to winners that we feel kind of represent the best of the best. All right, and with that, I'll do a quick intro for Rachel. So as I mentioned, she is the founder and director of the Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury, which is a project of Ohio Domestic Violence Network. Rachel is currently directing the center's first federal grant from the Office of Violence Against Women to increase collaboration and develop training and services for the brain injury, domestic violence, and sexual assault fields. Over the past 13 years at ODVN, Rachel has led multiple statewide initiatives on trauma-informed approaches, as well as other topics. She has trained hundreds of audiences and co-authored trauma-informed approaches, as well as peer-reviewed journal articles. Rachel is bilingual and a licensed independent social worker and a registered advocate. So welcome, Rachel. We're so glad to have you here today. I know this has been a topic.
Very happy to be here.
So happy to have you. Yeah, and this is one of our most popular webinars that we've had so far. We should have a full house today. So we'll go ahead and I'll turn things over to you. Let me go ahead and make you the host, and we'll go from there.
All right, I'm going to become a host. Hello, everybody out there in the internet. Really, really excited to be here with you today. I think the only thing that could make it better is if we were all sitting in a room together, which someday we will do again. I'm a trainer, so I do lots of training and talking and get lonely here at home, and my husband would like to send his gratitude to you all too, because I talk to him about my work all the time, and my children. So now that I get to talk to you, we might actually be able to have some conversations about some other things. So just to get us started, I am going to go ahead and share my screen and get back to the beginning of this. And I do encourage everybody, please put questions, in the chat box. No, I'm not in the chat box, in the question and answer box, but we'll make sure to get any kind of questions answered. And I know, as I was kind of getting ready, how you don't ever really think of things until you start doing something. Like I should have asked some kind of question about who here is doing domestic violence work and who's here from the brain injury and who here doesn't do any of that work. But I wanted to send a different poll question. So I'm going to put up a poll question real quick, just kind of a fun question, just kind of to see how people are doing. And this question is actually called, what temperature is cold for you? So for those of us who are up north, I'm in Ohio. One of the things that we always laugh about, you can go ahead and answer that question, is whenever we go to Florida. I actually was 1 year I was in Myrtle Beach over Thanksgiving, and we were literally the only people in the ocean we could ever see, and everyone else was walking around with sweatshirts on and long pants, and the water was cold, but we were okay. So I'm gonna give you guys. I'm gonna count backward from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we're gonna end polling and share results. So, it sounds like we have the largest group. We have some other people who are like, as long as it's isn't below 0, I can do it. I forgot to put something in there. I don't know how many of you are kind of the people where, I have a question where sometimes I do, what's your favorite part about winter? And some of you might be like, I don't really have a favorite part about winter. Just bring me back summer. So I'm joining you for at least it's sunny in Ohio. So thank you for sharing that. Just kind of a little fun to get us started with. And thank you for that introduction. I never quite know what to do when people are talking about kind of reading about things that I've done. But basically, in a nutshell, I started my career in domestic violence in 2003 in a large domestic violence shelter in Tampa Bay, Florida. And just very, very quickly fell in love with the work, fell in love with the possibilities, fell in love with the opportunity to really be there and support people, and sometimes among the most vulnerable and the most difficult times in their lives. I also was one of the people that, looking back on it and having spent the last, like I said, 13 years at the statewide coalition on domestic violence, I was a very, very well-intentioned advocate who didn't have any idea what I'm doing. And sometimes I go back and I think, oh my goodness, I can't believe I did that, or I thought that, or I said that. So I just would encourage everybody who's attending this webinar. I think one of the things that's so wonderful about doing, working in helping professions and working in this work is just the longer you do it, the more layers you realize it has, the more complex it gets, the more you realize you have to learn. So I feel like every year, even though I learn more, I honestly feel like I know less. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about how we stumbled into kind of this area, talking about this intersection of brain injury and domestic violence. But just to kind of, I know that we have had a long 2020. And I just think that one of the things that I've come to believe, and many of us who work in this field, who work in very, very hard trauma-based professions, I think that sometimes the only thing that we can control about situations is the way we think about them. So I'd like people to just share in the box really quickly, if they'd like to, just one thing that you're grateful for today. Um, as we think about that perspective and that gratitude. And there's a lot of things, again, when we think about our approach and the way we think about things, that can really change sometimes our perspectives of situations, particularly very difficult situations. So go ahead and be sharing that in the chat box with each other. I wanted to really quickly introduce the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and who we are and what we do. I know we have a national audience, but we are the statewide domestic violence coalition. So you should have something that is roughly the equivalent of us in your state. Often have domestic violence in them. So if you Google, statewide domestic violence coalition or network, it should come up. And many coalitions function in very, very different ways, do a lot of different things, often play a leading role when we think about policy and state response and system response to domestic violence. But almost all states have a piece of their work, a very, very important piece of their work, where local domestic violence service providers across the states are members. And we really kind of represent the needs and the interests of those members, and spend a lot of time working with members around training for domestic violence program staff, best practices, like kind of what are kind of best approaches for running and working with trauma survivors and survivors of domestic violence. So that's the organization that I work for. And like I said, I will have been there 14 years in April. And I'm going to give you just a little outline of today and kind of what we're going to be talking about. Um, and kind of the big picture of this all. We're going to start by spending some time learning about how our brain works and just kind of the functions of the brain, which is something that I just really had never known until I got into this and kind of got into this work. We'll talk a little bit about the big picture and the context, and then dive into this piece, which I really think is a piece for me, having spent my entire career in domestic violence. It just is amazing once you look back at it, this piece that I missed for so long. Talking about partner-inflicted brain injury and what that is, a little bit about traumatic brain injury and strangulation, and then a framework that we developed in Ohio over the last few years that was funded by a grant to help us kind of make domestic violence programs as accessible as possible to survivors who are struggling with brain injury or mental health. So I'll talk about kind of how we did things in Ohio, what some of the tools are that we developed, and you'll hopefully leave this webinar, first of all, realizing that we have just scratched the surface of this. So I'm just, whenever I put these things together, every single slide, I'm like, oh, I could talk about this slide for like an hour. This is such a big, such a kind of huge shift in an incredibly critically important piece for all of us who work in the field of domestic violence and the field of human services to better understand. And I'm going to start by sharing a video with you. And I want us to think about just kind of why we're here and how we got here. This is about 3 minutes long. And also, I think really highlights our partnership when we think about our partnership between I'll talk a little bit more about the research and the practice-based partnership that kind of made this work develop. This was produced by our research partner, the Ohio State University. So I'm going to begin this right now.
You hear people talk about evil in someone's eyes, like he looked through me like I wasn't even there. And I remember him putting his only.
Ooh, I'm sorry, I touched something. I didn't mean to touch something. I was just trying to turn it up. I'm going to try that one more time.
You hear people talk about evil in someone's eyes, like he looked through me like I wasn't even there. And I remember him putting his hands around my throat and like thinking like, I'm going to die.
When we think about the first picture of a domestic violence victim, the kind of classic iconic image of a battered woman as a woman with a black eye, right? Which one of the things that I realized now in the context of this work is she very well could have had a concussion in the context of that black eye, but it is something that none of us in the field have thought about.
And I don't remember much after that, but a nosy neighbor saved my life. Like somebody had heard all the stuff going on and knocked on the door, and that was the only reason I'm still alive.
And how we hadn't, it's one of those things you say it, you look at the data, we talk about brain injury and hits to the head, and it becomes very obvious very quickly. But even in my role at my organization as a statewide leader, having led a trauma-informed initiative across the state, trained in other states around the work that I was doing, never once had I mentioned brain injury. And how did we manage to miss that?
81% had reported being hit in the head. 50% or so many times that they couldn't remember. And 83% of the survivors working with the organizations reported that they had been choked or strangled so that their brains had been deprived of oxygen.
And the sad part for me is I'm an EMS educator. Like I teach trauma. That's like one of the things I love. And yet, even though as much as I know about trauma, I totally missed the strangulation part, the brain, and the effects that it's had on my body.
Many survivors who have been living with unmet need regarding brain injury intervention for a long time do end up developing comorbid issues like mental health issues and substance use issues, struggles with suicide. So unless we're identifying the underlying brain injury early, there can be other long-term health impacts for survivors of domestic violence who are not receiving the services that they need.
At one point, I attempted suicide. And so it was like, if they would have found this earlier, like, you know, my family has watched, and my friends and family have watched me try to end my own life and stuff. And it's like, that all could have been avoided had the right people had the right knowledge.
This has just kind of changed how we think about things and how we want to do things. And we're very, very hungry for helping us tackle this, because this really hasn't been tackled in this way before, and helping us from a practice level figure out what this needs to look like in the very complicated, very challenging work that domestic violence agencies do.
I'm gonna come back to our PowerPoint. If anybody has anything that they want to share in the chat box, kind of about that, any kind of reactions. And I'm sorry, I should have said at the beginning that, that some of the information that we're going to hear might be upsetting to people. We do know that domestic violence victims are people who are on this webinar, are people that are in this room, are people who, well, not in this room, I guess we're in this virtual room, that this is us too. So please make sure that you take care of yourselves. I will again try to let you know I don't have any kind of graphic pictures or anything, but brain injury is a terrible thing, and the violence that causes brain injury is a terrible thing, and something that shouldn't ever happen to anybody. But I think one of the big takeaways, the reason that we developed here in Ohio this Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury, to really provide leadership from a domestic violence perspective around this issue. I don't know if any of you, when you heard those numbers, we went on and again, we interviewed survivors who are accessing domestic violence services at 5 diverse different programs across the state of Ohio, and asked about their experiences with head injury and strangulation. Again, over 80% of survivors had been hit or hurt in the head. Over 80% of survivors, also over 8 in 10, had also been choked or strangled. Most of them had happened more than once. As my research partner, said, almost 50% said when we asked them how many times have you been hit in the head, they didn't even know. They couldn't put a number on that. With over 70% of the survivors we talked to saying that they were choked or strangled more than once, which is something that is terrifying. And also, again, this connection that we haven't made about the way in which they can impact our brain. And what we know is when our brains are impacted, that means every area and every piece and part of our lives can be impacted. So I really want us to think about, we can't ever talk about brain injury in the context of domestic violence kind of on its own. We have to make sure that we're understanding kind of this intersection between domestic violence, between traumatic stress. And then, when you throw on a whole nother level, it's almost all this information that has always been there. We've just haven't known it, haven't identified it, haven't made the connection, that we can't study brain injury or talk about brain injury without talking about these other pieces, and without understanding the larger context in which this brain injury occurs, which is one of the things that makes it really, really different when we're studying brain injury from this population, this group of people, than other groups. So we're actually going to get started by talking about the brain and really thinking about how a healthy brain works. And for those of you, I always joke that when I do these trainings, those of us who go into kind of advocacy professions, generally, science isn't our strong point. It definitely wasn't mine. And I think one of the things I really like to do is I like to figure out how to kind of communicate these really complicated brain is incredibly complicated. This is very much, if anybody's here is old enough to remember Cliff's Notes, I know I've got some of you out there, right? Before you could Google everything on the internet and figure out what it is. I know I've got some of you out there. But for those of you who remember Cliff's Notes, they were these little yellow books that was kind of like an overview. I remember them from high school. We had to read Shakespeare and nobody quite knew what was going on and what the plot was and all those kind of things. And it was written in plain language. This is kind of our Cliff's Notes version of the brain, kind of recognizing and acknowledging the brain is much more complicated. But I want us to think about our brain when we see our brain right here. First of all, our brain is, if you want to imagine, I forgot to do this, but I have a brain mold that's a Jello mold. I want you to imagine a Jello brain, a brain made out of the material and consistency of Jello. And that brain is kind of packed tightly inside our skull, inside our head. There's kind of liquid around it that protects us, but packed tightly inside of our skull. And there are different lobes of our brain, and our brain has different specialized areas. So kind of different pieces of our brain are responsible for different functions in our body. And also for the communication between those areas is what allows us to really go about and live our daily lives and do many things that we might not even think twice about. So I'm going to start with the yellow part of the brain here, the parietal lobe, which is the part of our brain that processes sensory information. So when we see something, when we hear something, when we smell something, that kind of process that information for us and helps us kind of understand what all of our senses are taking into to us, what those things are. In the back of our brain, we have the occipital lobe, which is really the visual processing center. So it's the part of our brain that is responsible for our eyesight and seeing things, and kind of interpreting what we see. I hope that as we're talking about this, one of the things that you can kind of understand are starting to realize is not only important that kind of each lobe or each area of our brain is healthy and working well, but these area of our brains need to communicate with each other well, and need to work together well. And I'll provide an example about that in just a minute. Then we have the blue part of our brain, which is responsible for kind of our memory and our learning and our language, which is the temporal lobe. And then we're going to talk about the red part of our brain in the front, the frontal lobe, which is a really, really important part of our brain, that really regulates, controls, and manages thoughts and emotions. So I'm going to take just a minute to talk about an example about how there might be things that we just think of kind of as normal experiences or normal things that just like everyone can be able to do. So let's think about, for example, you hear something and you hear a dog barking. So that sensory information is going to come kind of through that part of your brain, and you're going to hear something. But then you have this blue part of your brain, which is your memory, and your language. So a different part of our brain, we hear something, we know what that is. Us being able to say that sound is a dog barking. I can put language to that. I can share that. And me having the memory to say, oh, I've seen a dog before. And we can see kind of as our brain develops and grows. I don't know if you ever had little kids. I remember when my kids were little, they call all animals the same thing for a while. Like everything that was four-legged was a cat because they saw something. They didn't have too much language. They started to recognize that, oh, a cat doesn't make the same sound. There's this other animal that makes this different sound, and they look different and they have different words. And I remember seeing one of them. So we have all of those things. And then again, so we have our processing sensory information. We have our eyesight, that our visual processing that kind of sees that. We have that memory, learning, and language about what do we do when we see a dog. And then we have our frontal lobe, where the example I like to lose, if you ever have had kids, when you have young kids, or you've had people who really like dogs, who see a dog and hear a dog and just want to run up and say hi to the dog and hug the dog. And we spend a lot of our lives kind of wanting to do things that either aren't appropriate, aren't safe. We can't, it's not the right space, it's not the right area. That part of our brain up front that regulates, controls, and manages those thoughts or emotions. So even if we really like that dog and want that dog, we aren't asking the person if we can take that dog. We aren't going over and trying to walk it. We have this part of our brain that helps us control that. So we're going to take just one more minute to talk about the frontal lobe, which I was saying again. I don't know if any of you have heard kind of, we like to equate that part of our brain. An analogy that often many people use is it's an air traffic control center. So it's kind of the part of our brain that's really kind of directing all of this other stuff that's going on. And that's where our executive functions are housed. That is executive functions is a term to talk about kind of these different brain capacities that we have that help us kind of regulate, control, and manage our thoughts and emotions. So when we look at this list of things here, talking about things like starting things, beginning a task, initiating new behaviors, that is an advanced brain function. And I think for those of us who maybe never have had of significant trauma or any kind of brain injury that has impacted kind of that part of our brain that functions, it can be very, very confusing when we're working with people who are having a hard time getting started. Like, it doesn't seem that complicated, right? You just do it. You just get things started. You get up, you go. That is actually a brain function. Thinking about planning, organizing, and problem solving. Mental flexibility, which is an idea, kind of mental flexibility is our ability to kind of think about problems in different ways, to come up with alternative plans, to, if A doesn't work out, then we can try B, to see a situation and think about it from different perspectives. that's a brain function, as is our self-awareness. So how we are, how we're portraying ourselves in front of people, how we're coming off, how we're reading rooms, um, how we should be behaving or not behaving, kind of what is the norm here, controlling our impulses when we want things, and we can't always have what we want right now. I'm working very, very hard, particularly with my 6-year-old. I have my kids are 6, 10, and 13. And she does not do this well. She wants something and she wants it now and it's hers and she doesn't get why it's someone else's. Her frontal lobe is not well developed. But this frontal lobe even plays a role in our personality and in our emotions. So this is an incredibly important part of our brain. Our brain also connects to our body. It just kind of is everything to do with what it is and who we are and what we do. So we know that when the brain is healthy, I hope that that kind of overview helped us understand that we have, again, these different parts that do different things, but it's also really important that these parts of the brain work together really well, and that the wires and the connections between the different parts of the brain and kind of those different things are smooth, are efficient, kind of happen kind of quickly. And I think that one of the things that I have learned, in this project is that there's so much that my brain is able to do that just I have never even thought about. Um, People not being able to do that, or people's brains not being equipped to do those, or people's brains being hurt. But what happens when the brain gets hurt? It can cause the wires to misfire. It can cause some of those pieces and parts of the brain to not work so well. And it can result in problems in everyday functioning that I think for many, many, many years, and I will say decades, have often been attributed to other things when we think about this. Like I said, I came into this work around brain injury as not somebody who was new to domestic violence. I had a leadership role for a decade at my organization, doing DV specifically. So we're supposed to be ahead of the ball. My job was to know what was up in the domestic violence world and figure out how to communicate that with domestic violence service providers. But this just kind of just hit me in a way, when I stopped and sat down and thought about that. I just was speechless. I think that that is to think that we have, over 80% of survivors who are accessing domestic violence services who have had experiences that could very, very likely lead to impacts on the brain. But I had next to no knowledge about what that is and what that looks like. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about, again, thinking about that contextual piece, which is always so important in domestic violence, about that big picture, and taking just a few minutes to talk about trauma-informed approaches and coercive control and traumatic stress, and how all of that is just always a really important conversation to have as a background when we're talking about brain injury. But I'm going to, now you had a chance to meet Paula for a couple of minutes in our previous video, but I am very, very honored to kind of, what I'm doing is I have three very amazing, brave, courageous survivors. Paula from Ohio, Rebecca is from Nevada. I'm sorry, Nina's from Nevada, and Rebecca's from Arizona. Paula I know personally. She's a friend of mine, and works in Ohio with me. Rebecca and Nina are actually two domestic violence survivors that I met at a conference a couple of years ago, when I was doing a session around brain injury and domestic violence. The only session on brain injury and domestic violence in the whole conference, which is not unusual. I hadn't been to one. They're not there very often, but they came up and talked to me after the conference and said some amazing things in my session. So I actually ended up asking them, got their phone numbers and asked them at the end of the day. It was like, again, this is back when we were all in these big conferences, everyone running around to the breakout rooms. I said, would you be willing to just meet me up at the end of the day, and would it be okay if I just recorded some of your experience with my iPhone? Because I just haven't had the opportunity. I always think it's really important for us to have survivors' voices, and to be learning from survivors, and to be having survivors help teach us where we need to go with this. So I'm going to introduce you. Paula, Rebecca, and Nina are going to be helping me today, and kind of sharing what their experience has been and what it's looked like. So we'll hear from a couple of minutes about their experience, and they will be talking again. For those of us who have had experiences with domestic violence, just want to let you know there will be some stuff that will be shared. Again, nothing very graphic, but just wanted to make sure to be aware of that there could be some things that might be a little upsetting.
There were so many things that when I look back, now that I know, that just screamed what was going on. And had somebody with some knowledge taken the time, my outcome in my life may be completely different.
My abuser did everything he could to hide it with a steel toe boot, beating me on the head. Nobody can see what you're doing what they do here. You know you have lumps all over the place, but nobody can see it. So he was smart. I had gone through a 2.5-year relationship, and I'm at partner violence, domestic violence, and of course, knight in shining armor at first, and it soon escalated, but I basically went through 2.5 years. Physical abuse wasn't every day, but it was about it averaged out to maybe like every 6 weeks or so, that he would come at me, he would wrap his hands around my neck and try to strangle me, and then he would follow it with hits to the head. Either if I was standing up or over carpet, he would do closed fist punches to the back of my head. Last March of 2017, he was finally arrested. He attempted to strangle me twice, and then he closed fist punches, and then he fractured my lowest 3 ribs.
The past can sneak up on you at any time. It can be a smell, it can be a sound, but it may be something as simple as I'm in Kroger's and somebody walks by with the same cologne or the same voice. And it's just like the body keeps score. It's just like for a minute, I'm back to 2006.
So we will continue to be hearing, we have a couple of more clips that we will continue to be hearing about from Paula, Nina, and Rebecca and kind of their experience. But, I think that is a great illustration of, again, this overlap and impact of head trauma, of traumatic stress, and of the way it impacts survivors in so many different ways. So we're going to start again by just kind of establishing a real definition when we're talking about domestic violence. Kind of what does that mean? How do we define it? When we say domestic violence, what is that? And I'm going to read this definition for you, and I am going to encourage you to put in the chat box, if you'd like, as you're reading this definition, any words that kind of stick out to you. If we were to make this definition simpler, or kind of what kind of the core of domestic violence or abuse. So I'm going to read this to you: a pattern of coercive and assaultive behaviors, including physical, sexual, and psychological attacks, as well as economic coercion that adults and adolescents use against their intimate partners. So what words stick out for you? Somebody go ahead and throw something in the chat box. Now, there's a couple hundred of you out there, and hopefully some of you are listening to me. What do you think? I'm going to give you all just a minute to respond and see if you can find that. But, I think really thinking about this pattern, it's really, really important to understand domestic violence as a pattern. It's not something that happens just once. When we're working with individuals who have experienced domestic violence and they're in a relationship, I don't know if you've had an experience where you've ever walked into the middle of a movie and you don't know who's who and you don't know what's what, you don't know why things are happening. And there could be some things that happening that don't make any sense at all. But you don't understand that because you haven't seen the movie since the beginning. You don't know who's who. You don't know why things are happening. We are walking into, or survivors are often walking into our lives in the middle of their story, in the middle of their movie. So us understanding that pattern and how things that might have happened yesterday or last week or last month or last year or years ago can still impact what's going on today. The other thing I want us to think about is that whole role of coercion. So when we talk about coercion is really that whole concept of, that it's when you're kind of compelled to do something, when there's force involved, that you can't just kind of make decisions the same way you or I or somebody who is in a safe relationship is able to, where like, if I do this, it's okay. And if I don't do it, it's not okay. And I can just kind of decide that there are consequences all the time that survivors are weighing. And those consequences change and shift can be different one day to another. I know that's one of the things that sometimes for those of us who work with domestic violence victims makes things we get frustrated because, we're like, well, this worked fine yesterday and now that doesn't seem like a good idea. But again, it's because things change. And that risk assessment that I'm doing and what feels safest, like maybe yesterday it was safest for me to do this, but maybe today it's safest for me to do something different. So I want us to really think about that role of coercion and coercive control, that being a key part of domestic violence and all of the ways in which kind of abusers assert that control, which includes control of things like my movements and where I can go and what I can do and who I can talk to and how I dress and all of that kind of stuff. My thoughts and what I think about, even my feelings about myself and others. We talk about mental health coercion when we talk to the survivors, the same survivors who reported their incredibly high, their incredibly extensive experiences with head injuries. We asked them about mental health too. We asked them about mental health coercion, which is we asked them, have their partners ever done anything to make them feel crazy on purpose? And over 90% said yes. Have your partner called you names, called you crazy, said that there was something wrong with you? Substance use coercion is an area which really looks at the ways in which abusive individuals can kind of introduce substances or get people addicted to certain things or kind of pressure people to use certain substances. And there's an incredibly high in our study that we did, and when our survivors, over half of survivors said that they can interfere with recovery, that can discourage people from seeking treatment. Physical health coercion can be the ways in which abusers try to prevent survivors from getting their physical health needs taken care of and tell them not to go to the doctor, tell them not to take medication, won't let them go to the doctor, are supposed to come home and be with the kids so I can go get my medical care and don't do that. Or ways and barriers in which abusers prevent people from getting medical care. And we think about that in the context of head injuries. And then reproductive coercion, which is another area, kind of a newer area of research, which looks at the ways in which kind of abusive partners do things like sabotage birth control, pressure their partners to get pregnant, try to force women who are pregnant to have abortions, or try to control kind of those decisions about pregnancy. I'm sorry I didn't make this disclaimer before, but we do know that domestic violence is something that happens to people of all different age, of all different genders, of all different sexual orientations, all different races, all different economic classes. But the reason that I'm talking about this, particularly when we're talking about head injuries and people having kind of extensive trauma caused by violence to their head, is almost exclusively a group of women that is almost universally violence that's inflicted by men. So that's why in this, I'm not at all discounting anyone else's situation, but that's just what we have learned. We also know that when doing national surveys and talking to victims of domestic violence, that men and women often report different impacts of domestic violence and them it being affected in different ways. But this is one of the ways that, again, appears to this point to be right now pretty uniquely a female experience when talking about the head trauma. But when we think about this coercive control and the way in which this plays out, I want to move into thinking about this whole concept of gaslighting. And I don't know if any of you are new to gaslighting, but gaslighting is really the ways when we think about that, and kind of defined as this attempt to overwrite another person's reality and get another person really questioning their perspective, their judgment, what's going on, what's happening, what's real, what's not real. So I'm going to read this to you and ask, it's just an example of a little poem that said, that didn't happen. Well, if it did, it wasn't that bad. And if it was, it's not that big of a deal. And if it is, it's not my fault. And if it was, I didn't mean it. And if I did, you deserve it. So can you think again about that kind of crazy making where things could be happening in my relationship, something could be feeling wrong or off or something like that, and I am just almost programmed to question my own perspective, my own view. And I think for those of you who work with domestic violence, one of the things that we know is, individuals will talk about if they are able to escape relationships, it's this kind of the impact of this emotional abuse and kind of the emotional torture that sometimes survivors go with, coupled with the economic abuse that really are the things that end up even years after escaping an abusive relationship that still can create major barriers in a person's life. So, and what we know is domestic violence is also traumatic. So, many of us who do domestic violence work have been talking about trauma-informed care. It feels like forever. I did it for years and years. But we're just gonna take just a couple of minutes to just also think about the psychological trauma that is caused by domestic violence. And we can define trauma as something that is overwhelming, something that overwhelms us. And it has all of these different effects. It has physical impacts, it has emotional impacts, it has physiological impacts. So physiological being kind of the way in which our body operates, the release of hormones, kind of our biology, it affects that, and it has cognitive effects. And this is something that we've known for a long time, and we look at this ways in which psychological trauma can impact us, where it can do things like, manage and regulate feelings, make that more difficult and make it harder for us to self-soothe and calm ourselves down, to trust others, thoughtfully plan, have the energy to get things done, connect with others, and tell stories. It can increase things like tension, anxiety, panic, and emotional volatility, and kind of that blaming of ourselves of what happened and it feeling like it's our fault. A part of that is also because there is significant stigma that surrounds domestic violence. So, domestic violence victims, if they do reach out for help, if they do tell somebody, they're often blamed for it. They're often asked questions about, well, why did you stay and why did you put up with that? And why do you let somebody treat you like that? Kind of thinking about that, which very, very much makes me feel like it's my fault. Kind of it increases our suspicion of others and that core kind of avoidance and numbing and disconnection. And also, I just think that, having an understanding of substance use, a trauma informed understanding of substance use, about how drugs, alcohol, other substances can be used to cope, but can also be used sometimes to manage some of the symptoms of trauma. Where I've worked with survivors who one of the reasons that their drinking started to become problematic is because they were having really, really terribly scary nightmares. And so they couldn't sleep. And if they drank enough, they would pass out and get some sleep. So it was really when we talk about using that alcohol to kind of treat the symptoms of the trauma again, we see how complicated that is. And for those of us who have maybe been in domestic violence for a while, we've thought about this, and this is a really complicated puzzle. But now, and I want to take some time to really think about a whole nother layer, of which we need to lay on top of this already a whole nother like little crooked one of those little tiny puzzle pieces in your 1,000-piece puzzle, that's all blue, that's hard to find, this really important piece, that we just haven't talked about a lot. But we do understand that we need trauma informed frameworks to understand this intersection. And for those of you who, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with trauma or traumatic stress, trauma informed frameworks are really, we could do a whole several hours on that. I spent several years working on this, but it's really just kind of that recognition that people's traumatic experiences really lives out in so much of their lives and in how they respond to things and their behaviors, and their thought process. And really, it is shifting that question. If you've ever been to training on trauma informed care, trauma informed approaches, it really is thinking about how is what's going on in your life related to what happened to you, as opposed to asking what's wrong with you and what's wrong with this person. So that's kind of our background for this picture, which is a big background, which is a complex background. But I want us to start thinking about, when we think about this whole idea of what happens when we insert this head trauma. And again, I don't know if we're talking about starting this head trauma, because I think that this is something that for those of us who have done this work for a long time, we are not talking about kind of a new group of people we have never been working with before. We are talking about individuals we have been working with for years and at times decades, that have had these experiences and that the connections have not been made. The pieces of the puzzle haven't been put together. Because we know when we think about a domestic violence victim that might have been hit or hurt in the head, had some kind of neurological trauma, which we'll talk about what that is and what that looks like. Um, that's also happening in the context of a larger environment of psychological trauma where people are experiencing coercive control. Often violence has escalated. So there are very few people who, the first time that they're ever assaulted or they're ever physically hurt, which is one piece of domestic violence, but absolutely not the only one, is that they're hurt in the head. So we often see violence getting more severe and getting worse. Victims are often entrapped and kind of stuck in that environment. And there's often stalking going on, often sexual assault or sexual coercion. The number of domestic violence victims I've worked with who have had things happen to them, like, it's not that I think that we think about sexual assault in the context of domestic violence or in the context of relationships. Many people don't put that name, that label. So what do we call when my partner just keeps asking me for sex and won't let me go to sleep till I do it? Or won't talk to me for days until I have sex with them. Like, that's not sexual assault like we think about it. But I also think that the other thing is thinking about the pain. Like, when you are assaulted, you're physically assaulted, it hurts. I had an experience where I was jumping on the trampoline with my son, and I got like one of in my ribs. I don't know, the rib wasn't exactly dislocated, but somehow he landed on my back, and like my rib shifted just a little bit, and I ended up going to the doctor, a day later. I it hurt to breathe for like 24 hours, and I couldn't move and I couldn't sit. And I just kept thinking about the number of domestic violence victims that I had worked with that had obvious signs of assault. And I never even thought about just the physical pain. And of course, like, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't do any of those things. So these are all pieces that are happening. This is happening in a much larger context of other things. And we're going to take a minute and we're going to do another quiz, and I'm going to pull this up real quick. And I want to ask you all, this is when we think about where do abusers, what do we know kind of from science that the target what part of the body? What would you say? So I'm going to give you all just a minute and see what people say and kind of what those answers are. Um, and the options are the head, neck, and face, and the torso and the upper arms.
Rachel, we had a question come in. Do you mind if I read that off to you while
Absolutely.
everyone responds?
Ashley, I can get to talking about this so no one can insert a question. So good job, Ashley, please.
All right. So Diane is asking how much research is being done on brain damage from blood perfusion injuries following chokeholds?
I think that very, very little of which I am aware of, but I do think when we talk about chokeholds being one of the ways that when talk about violence and what it looks like, and when we talk about strangulation, we have more and more survivors talking about chokeholds as one of those uses of strangulation. I'm going to close this poll out. I'm going to give it, and then I'm going to go back to that. So Diane, thank you very much for that question. I'm going to give everyone 4, 3, 2, 1 last chance to vote. Okay, end polling, and I'm going to share the results. So we see 65% of you said head, neck, and face. 32% of you said torso, and 3% said upper arms. So, the answer is the head, neck, and face, though we know torsos, violence is often directed at places that can be hidden, that aren't obvious, that people can't easily see. But I think, again, and I'll make sure to talk about chokeholds a little bit later, Diane, but, I think it's recognizing that sometimes this violence that's directed at the head, neck, and face is violence that does not leave marks, that does not leave obvious signs, and all of that. Thank you all. I'm catching up on the chat real quick because for some reason it wasn't open for me. Thank you, Ashley. Instead of asking what's wrong with you, again, asking what happened to you. But I think that it's interesting that even though 65% of you, who many of you work in domestic violence, a lot of you don't, we're like, we've always known that heads have been a target, particularly when we look at kind of emergency room domestic violence victims who access emergency room services. An incredible percentage of them access emergency room services or go to the emergency room because of head injuries. And I think that there are so many barriers to domestic violence victim getting treatment after an assault. It often is, and I think even more so in what we're seeing because of COVID and because of that becoming even harder and harder, you almost don't go to get medical treatment unless you can't not. Does that make sense? Like, unless something's broken and you're bleeding or you've had a head trauma that you it just is at a point where you have to go get some treatment. But I want to show you the cover of this magazine, and this is actually a magazine, Miss Magazine, August 1976. And we see battered wives help for the secret victim next door. This was the first magazine covered in the country that address domestic violence. And this is, again, that picture we think of when we think of domestic violence. And we saw this picture And this is now, like I was saying, very, very obvious head trauma. And somehow, and there's a lot of reasons, a whole nother training, people can follow up and talk to me. There's a great article that I can send to you that is actually an academic article, but it talks about how we have understood, kind of as a history. It's very kind of high level, but the historical understanding of boxing. Thinking about boxing, and very, very early on in boxing, as early as the early 1900s, we were like, wow, when people are hit in the head, that has to impact their brain over and over. And we understood that as a neurological problem. Somehow, even though we have clear, convincing evidence of this very first picture that this domestic violence victim could have had a brain injury, we almost immediately started talking about the social and psychological kind of influences and kind of what, well, she must have mental health problems and kind of what it is that looks like. And we're going to hear from Paula, Nina, and Rebecca about that in just a little bit. But I want to ask you another, we're going to put up another poll. And I'm going to ask you another poll question, thinking about the role of strangulation and chokeholds. So we're going to talk about strangulation, thinking about the whole intersection of strangulation and traumatic brain injury. So the question is, does strangulation cause a traumatic brain injury? And
All right, I have another question that came in. Do you mind if I interject with that one? All right, so
then the questions can come in, right, Ashley?
that's right. So Sarah asked, how can you distinguish between a TBI and a disability? She goes on, she says, I'm currently trying to get a client services that may have a disability, but she was also brutally attacked with the butt of a gun in her head. So I'm thinking some part of it may be TBI.
Yeah. So I think that is something, thank you, Sarah. And I'd love for you to follow up to kind of help you think about that a little more. What we do know is TBI absolutely can cause a disability. And I do not think that the question is, remember that our three overlapping circle or our several overlapping circles. When we think about the combination of the psychological trauma and the neurological trauma that happen, we could think about that whole kind of neurological damage to the brain, which hopefully I'm going to end polling at the end of this webinar. You'll be able to understand a little bit better that could very much play a role. And people are on disability and do get disability due to head trauma for lots of different reasons, including accidents, including sports injuries, including military service. But I wanted to share these results with you. So strangulation caused a traumatic brain injury. 166 out of the 168 of you who answered said yes. And this is always my trick question, because guess what? You are wrong. Just like I was wrong for 6 months into my grant. I will go ahead and explain this to you in a little bit when we talk about, so just take a pause. It really has to do with the mechanisms of brain injury. So I'm sorry, I didn't share the results. Here's the results. I'm with it. So 99% of you said yes. Strangulation causes a different type of brain injury. It's actually called an anoxic hypoxic brain injury, which is a brain injury that results from oxygen deprivation. We'll get through talking about that and kind of the interactions and what does that looks like in just a few minutes and kind of defining that. But that's really where it came from, really needing to make sure that we're not talking about traumatic brain injury over here and like it's something that's totally it's medically and technically a different type of brain injury than strangulation, chokeholds, brain injuries that result from lack of oxygen. So you have brain injuries that result from external force and brain injuries that result because the oxygen because the brain doesn't get oxygen. What we know is both of those are happening to domestic violence survivors. So when we're talking about traumatic brain injury, we should be talking about strangulation too. When we're talking about strangulation, we need to be talking about traumatic brain injury too, in both of them. So I'm going to be spending some time kind of talking through what that is. But I will let you know, I thought in domestic violence world, we just put strangulation as a part of traumatic brain injury all the time. But it medically is not one. It just is not considered to be one. And I'll define these for you a little bit later. Did another question come in, Ashley, or are we good? I'm trying to keep
Yes, actually. So I'm not sure who submitted this, but she said this might be an obvious answer, but does putting someone in a headlock cause similar damage as chokeholds?
Well, and I think when we talk about headlocks, like a lot of that has to do is how much of it is our oxygen restricted to their brain. So like I can put my hands around my neck right here when we think about that. and I'm able to breathe. I'm totally fine. There's not any pressure. My brain is getting all of the oxygen that it needs. So what we know about, and this is, I wish I had included this quiz question, but I took it out for time reasons. But our brain actually weighs 2% of our body weight, uses 20% of the oxygen in our body. So our brain needs a lot of oxygen because it does amazing things for everything. So I think that when we talk about what we call it, whether it's a headlock, whether it's a chokehold, whether anytime my breathing, so and it's not just my breathing is restricted or my brain is prevented from getting oxygen, that is something that can cause a brain injury. So, and this is again, this whole concept, and I bet many of you have not heard before this concept of partner-inflicted brain injury, which actually came from a master's thesis of a good friend of mine. I'll show you. It is available for those of you who kind of like this stuff. It's academic, but it's fascinating. And it was talking about, it's kind of creating a new kind of category of brain injury that talks about brain injury that's inflicted by an intimate partner. And we're really kind of defining of that to include strangulation, suffocation, chokeholds, headlocks, plus the blows to the head that can cause a traumatic brain injury, concussion, or other types of brain injury while experiencing domestic violence. And I want you all to take a minute and just look at these pictures. And I want you, if you'd be willing to put in the chat box, what are some of the differences when you look at what most of our information we have from brain injury is either from sports or from the military? And look at these three pictures and what is different about a brain injury caused by domestic violence. Oh, so sometimes I get the chat to come up. What's different? So the very first thing people always say is a helmet. There is no helmet. That people see that they have head protection, and nobody goes into a relationship thinking I'm going to need a helmet, right? Devery talks about, and I know some of you talk about male versus female. There's not really a choice. You trust the person, that there's a warning, that, this is something that occurs. It's done by someone we care about. Even when we talk about concussions, it's, Brent talks about it's unwilling, not saying that anybody who signs up for the military or who signs up for football deserves a brain injury. Absolutely not. But it's one of those things that you kind of, could be, I mean, not just you, but everybody knows that's why we have helmets. Ashley talks about medical attention is sought immediately after sports and injury. Absolutely. So like there are people there. These things also happen when other people are around, right? So a lot of the reality is a lot of our brain injury responses have been, we train coaches, we train platoon leaders, we train parents. If you have a kid in sports, at least in Ohio, we get a concussion sheet when we sign up our kids for sports. So you train all of these people to be there watching. So if it happens, you have all these people that I know. Ashley talks about the injury is taken seriously. So I mean, I just even think that kind of like, think about the number of victims we talked to said, I don't even know how many times I've been hit in the head. It's not this, I was fine, this injury happened that I know is an injury, and I was okay here, and now I'm not okay here, and it is due to this injury. So you all had done a great job like hitting on some of those characteristics. Oh, I could talk about this forever. But I think some of it is, it's talking about experienced overwhelmingly by women. In the inflicted intentionally, a lot of the TBI definitions, almost all TBIs are accidental. And when we think about that, like, even like I said, football players are not trying to give other people brain injuries. If somebody has a brain injury as a context of like an explosive device, an IED, that it's not that was specifically targeted at you to give you a brain injury. It's done by a person that you know and love, and it's done in private, and it's often repeated. When working with individuals who've come from the brain injury side of thing and are starting to want to work with domestic violence victims, it's something that hardly anybody's ever considered studying strangulation, because strangulation is something that is so prevalent in domestic violence, but happens to hardly anyone else. There are no football players that have been strangled. So when you talk about you could have external trauma to the head. So like part of your brain is actually bruised because you've been hit. And if we work with domestic violence victims who have been thrown to the floor or pushed on the floor, banged their head, and then were jumped on and strangled, you're also having oxygen deprivation to the brain at the same time. You've talked about some of those barriers to identification. So how do we know when it happens? The barriers to evaluation and care, the stigma around that. And we'll talk a little bit more about how sometimes the symptoms are often attributed to something else. And there's all this blame and shame that comes along with it. So we're going to go back and we're going to hear from Paula, Nina, and Rebecca, and they're just going to be sharing about kind of in hindsight what some of the things that they noticed were and kind of what they assumed was happening. Oh, sorry. There we go.
As I got further on in the relationship, I started noticing a lot of weird physical symptoms, but I kind of equated them just to be from the drama at home, from the drama and the trauma. I was working in the hospital as a nurse, and a patient would ask me to write down a phone number for them, and I would have to keep writing it on more than one sheet because my numbers would get really jagged. My hand was clumsy. I thought I was just exhausted from the trauma.
I just thought I was clumsy all the time, but my thing was just the fact of then when it was going on and after I got away from him, I was like, something's wrong with me. I'm not remembering to do things. My eyes twitching, I'm having these awful headaches and I'm stumbling on things. And I didn't know that was anything to have a brain injury.
I didn't want to deal with what happened, so I did a lot of binge drinking. So I was having nightmares and stuff, drinking to pass out, taking caffeine pills in the morning to function. In 2008, it started affecting my job, so I stopped drinking like I was. I was having flashbacks, I was having nightmares, and I wasn't able to hold conversations. A lot of mistakes. I was passing out. Like I would change position and I would just fall over.
My vision started to get a lot worse. People were noticing my eyes looked funny. My pupils were different sizes. I even went to my family doctor because I thought I had an eye infection, and he even kind of looked at my eyes funny, and then he just waved it off.
One particular one where I went to the hospital thinking that I was going to have a stroke. I couldn't, the left side of my face, it was numb. I couldn't walk right, and they diagnosed me with a simple migraine, which I didn't even have a headache.
Everybody around me started to see symptoms that I was not aware of, especially aggressive, as it was explained to me.
I was yelling, like people would say certain things, get angry at them and yell at them, and sometimes I would just start bawling over something that should have been easy.
So when we hear that, and I know that we have many people on this call that work in domestic violence services. And I just want us to think about all of those things sound like all of our troublesome clients that we've had in the past, or those people that have really struggled sometimes to get what they need out of our services. So we see this brain injury looking like some of these things. And again, we're talking about this intersection of brain injury and trauma and some of the thinking problems and having problems concentrating and problems organizing and really difficulty remembering things, especially new information. I just think of all of the survivors that I worked with that, I'd have a case management meeting with them, and then a week later we talk and they look at me like we didn't have this conversation. And I'm going to be totally honest with you. This is like confessions of a real advocate. Like I just was like, we had this conversation. You heard this stuff. Why are you not motivated? So again, remember our brain functions, our initiation. You've been here all week. You haven't done anything. I'm thinking about some of those mood issues with irritability, depression, and increased emotions and anxiety and that anger. Both Rebecca and Paula talked about kind of those outbursts and problems controlling emotions and people being very angry. And then some of those physical problems around headache and lack of energy and being sensitive to light, that sensitivity to light or noise. But, that whole kind of, even though all of that stuff was kind of right there, it was always kind of assumed. Nobody ever really thought about this as the way the brain could be impacted. So what we need to understand about brain injuries is that they can cause a health condition. And there are a couple of different types of health condition. So acute health conditions are things like a broken arm for most people. It happens, or strep throat. It happens, You get your medicine for your strep throat, and then you don't have strep throat anymore. You don't have to worry about it. Even, I mean, know some people could have broken bones that end up in long-term, impacts them for a long time. But a lot of us, if we break something, we get our cast, we have to do a little bit of physical therapy, it gets better, and we're done. But there are other health conditions, which are chronic conditions that happen, heal some, but often need to be managed. When we think about things like high blood pressure, things like diabetes, that it could be something, it might never really go away. We learn how to adapt, we learn how to live productive lives, but it really is something that could always kind of play a role in how we do things. And I think that we're learning, particularly when we talk about, domestic violence caused, brain injury caused by domestic violence, with how much of it that happens, how often it happens, how many other things are going on at the same time. This is really in kind of some of that more of kind of thinking about this as more of a chronic condition that might be something that we really need to think about and pay attention to for a while. I'm going to take a breath real quick and see, Ashley, if we have any more questions that we should address at this moment, or.
Yeah. So one that popped up a while back was, can intense gaslighting or manipulation or domestic violence kind of, can that cause brain injury, in the context of what you're sharing, or is it only physical?
Well, and I think that that's one of the things when we talk about kind of gaslighting and emotional abuse and all of that, and this is a whole nother training that we have. So we talk about, if you've learned about psychological trauma, traumatic stress trauma informed care, it can absolutely cause, and we think about our stress response system, and we think about the way in which the brain can be impacted by things like emotional abuse. It absolutely does have an impact, but when we're talking about partner-inflicted brain injury, a traumatic brain injury, kind of a neurological brain injury, where cells in our brain have actually been damaged or hurt, that is something that would be inflicted by something else. So, for example, the frontal lobe, which it can be impacted by trauma and traumatic stress, and kind of the hormone system, the fight, flight, or freeze piece, absolutely can have an impact on our memory. But we don't have neurological damage, which was inflicted by some kind of injury. So can it impact the brain? Absolutely. And yes. And is it important that we're also understanding that people are trying to heal from this neurological trauma in the context of this ongoing trauma, but it doesn't cause a brain injury in that way, like, a piece or part of my brain, there are cells in my brain on kind of a cellular, molecular, neurological structure have been damaged. I hope that kind of helps understand that. But I think, again, we can't talk about one without talking about the other.
Yeah. And this kind of goes back to earlier, and I think you mentioned you were going to go kind of back into that connection between traumatic brain injury and strangulation. So you may cover it later, but the question was, just to clarify, you're differentiating between traumatic brain injury and brain injury, in the context of strangulation.
It's actually another category, kind of class of brain injury, that's called acquired brain injury. So there's traumatic brain injury and there's acquired brain injury. And strangulation is one of the causes of that. I'm going to perfect segue into this next session. And we'll talk about that. Give me just about a couple more minutes to talk about these health conditions, and then we're going to move right into defining that. So, but the other thing that we know about any health condition, like, we're not going to manage our diabetes well if we don't know we have diabetes, right? So they must be correctly identified in order to, like I said, if you are having problems with your feet, you don't go to a cardiologist. We have to be identifying them correctly. And this is just another couple of minutes from Paula, Nina, and Rebecca talking about their experience of kind of really, so many of their symptoms being attributed to mental illness. So give me 1 minute. This is about 2 minutes long.
I was working in the ERs as a paramedic, so there was a lot of nurses who, and even a couple of doctors who said, they would ask me about depression. They were questioning me about suicide, about with my mood swings, if I have ever been checked for being bipolar. I wish I would have listened more, because maybe things would have gotten resolved sooner, because it was later that year that I attempted suicide to take my own life. So.
when he had assaulted me last March, the police were thinking that I was lying or that I was making things up because my answers were really choppy. When I was trying to get help from the police and fire departments ended up convincing my family that I was psychiatrically ill, and I got involuntarily committed. In the process, a total of 6 psychiatrists evaluated me, and I told all 6 of them the history of the recent to further back head injuries, the strangulations. Nobody ever did a medical examination on me. Wrote it up as that I was bipolar and I was delusional and paranoid, and they wrote up all my symptoms being a mental illness of bipolar.
We're just like passed off as, okay, she's mental, she's got issues, and we don't worry about it. But now that we have somebody working and saying, yes, there's a brain injury here.
So this will get to some of those questions about really understanding traumatic brain injury. And this is something that always, and then strangulation, the role that strangulation plays in causing a different type of brain injury. But a traumatic brain injury is a change to how your brain normally works due to a bump, blow, or jolt to the head. So it's some kind of external something that kind of hits and hurts your brain. Or it could be that you are kind of shaken severely, and your brain actually, we'll get through talking through what that is in a little bit. Where strangulation is, again, where someone puts pressure on the throat or the neck that results in a restriction of oxygen and blood flow to the brain. Our brain gets oxygen through our breath, but our brain also gets oxygen through our blood flow. So we're going to talk for just a minute again about traumatic brain injuries. And this has been kind of when we think of concussion, this has been kind of what we think when we think concussion. But we really need to start thinking possible concussion when we see pictures like this. And sometimes we don't see pictures like this. Sometimes people don't have any signs. When we have people who disclose or tell us something about having head trauma, we need to be thinking this too. So what happens in a TBAS, this will hopefully help us understand, is that there's some kind of external force that causes your brain to move around and collide with your skull. So again, it's packed tightly in your skull. There's some liquid, but it kind of actually bonks into your skull. And what it does is it bruises brain tissue and tears blood vessels. This is why somebody was asking about kind of gaslighting. Gaslighting doesn't bruise brain tissue. Gaslighting actually absolutely impacts your brain and impacts different systems of your body, but it doesn't kind of cause, when we think about that inflammation in the brain from an injury. What we often see in traumatic brain injuries, that damage occurs at the impact and sometimes the opposite point. So have you ever seen like whiplash, where if your brain is jerked around your head really quick, it can kind of bang up against here and then bang up back against here, depending on how the force is coming. And that damage can sometimes be detected through scans. Now, when we talk about the other thing that's really important about traumatic brain injury, you have this super highway where you have the nerve fibers link cells, you have all of the connections that connect all of the different pieces and parts of the brain. They linked cells and they linked parts of the brain, and they link the brain to the body. So even when we think about some of the physical problems where people have problems with balance, people have problems with vision, it really is how those fibers between us get stretched or broken, resulting in communication problems. So it could be communication problems within brain regions. It could be a communication problems where I see something, but I can't figure out what it's called. Or, I'm recognizing what it is, but I don't have a memory. I'm having a hard time putting language. I'm having a hard time understanding language. It can also be between the brain and the body. And one of the things that's really important to understand, damage is not detected, often not detected by tests. I neglected to, what we know about kind of concussions, and particularly concussions and mild traumatic brain injury. They're kind of interchangeable. Some people call them concussions. Some people call them mild traumatic brain injury. It's very, very common for there not to be any kind of, if you do a CT scan or if you do an MRI, you don't see anything. So there's actually there's new recommendations among pediatrics that you're not automatically doing brain scans, because then what happens, people say, oh, I don't see anything, which means you're fine. And that doesn't mean you're fine. So just on a cellular level, when we see kind of how small those impacts can be, they're not picked up by that. And particularly when the highway is impacted. So when we talking about in a traumatic brain injury, the most likely part of the brain to be hurt is really our frontal lobe, which is, again, remember what it's responsible for, that mental processes such as thinking, decision making, and planning. For those of you who work with me in domestic violence, like a lot of our services really just kind of assume that people can plan well, are able to kind of think through things, can make decisions. And then we think about that hearing and listening, and comprehending and remembering, which were all kind of separate things. When we think about comprehending something, really understanding what somebody's saying and remembering something, those are two separate processes. And I'm sure many of you have had experiences where you're working with a survivor and they're kind of looking at you and you know that they're not quite kind of getting what you're saying, but they're shaking their head. But it's just, I don't know if you've ever worked and say, oh, it's like the lights on, but nobody's home. That could be a very good indicator that somebody has had head trauma. And then actually we're going to do this quiz very quick. I never have enough time. So I'm going to get my next quiz, and this is when we talk about, again, that overlap between strangulation and head injuries. So what percentage of people who were strangled will also hit or hurt in the head? So for those of us who have worked in domestic violence, I think we've actually talked probably more about strangulation than we've talked about traumatic brain injuries. But we've talked about strangulation in a very different way, not really in the way where we're talking about it can cause, neurological damage to the brain that can have a long-term impact on you. So I'll give 5. I'm going to count backwards like I always do to 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I'm going to end this. I'm going to share results with you. And we had 57% of you said up to 97%, 33% said 65%, and 10% of you said 50%. It really is up to 97% of survivors. When we did our interviews, we interviewed 41 survivors who had been strangled. Only one of them hadn't also had a history of head trauma. So anytime we're talking about strangulation, we also need to be talking about head trauma, and talking about I think that, we're going to take a minute to talk about strangulation. And like I said, any one of these trainings, traumatic brain injury, we could spend 6 hours talking about TBI. We could spend 6 hours talking about strangulation. So this is, again, hopefully going to just be an introduction, and you'll be able to have more time to dig into some of these pieces. But strangulation is not technically a brain injury. Strangulation is an act. It is when someone puts pressure on the throat and the neck that results in restriction of oxygen and or blood flow to the brain. So like I said, blood is one of the main ways in which our brain gets oxygen. So sometimes it's restricting our breathing and sometimes it's restricting that blood flow. We're going to talk about this for just a minute. So again, that's what I was talking about. A different type of brain is called an hypoxic anoxic brain injury. So I'm finally answering that question. Strangulation, chokeholds, suffocation, headlocks can cause what's called an hypoxic anoxic brain injury, which is hypoxia is when you have a reduced amount of oxygen that gets to your brain. And when your oxygen is completely cut off, an anoxic brain injury is what ends up happening. Strokes are other kind of things that brain injuries that are caused by strokes can be anoxic brain injuries. You have certain parts of your brain that don't get oxygen for a specific period of time, which is one of the reasons why if someone has a stroke, getting them into the hospital is so critical in getting them the treatment that they need, because time really matters. So it is caused by strangulation and other types of violence, as you all have said some of these. Chokeholds, having something put over the face so a person can't breathe, being sat on in a way that interferes with breathing, or kind of that pressure on the neck. We also know that strangulation is a particularly dangerous type of violence. And the abusers who strangle are the most dangerous and deadly perpetrators. So I think that for a long time, we've talked about strangulation as it's really dangerous and increases your risk that you'll be killed. One of the things we have to be really careful about strangulation, because it can cause internal injuries that end up, they can swell, they can kill you days later. But we also know that the vast majority of people who are strangled, like the 83% of survivors in our shelters who have been strangled, don't end up dying, but might end up with long-term cognitive, physical, and health consequences due to that strangulation. But kind of what we're thinking is, we know that there have been many people, anytime we work with somebody who's been strangled, we should absolutely be thinking about that being an indicator that their partner is particularly dangerous. Kind of when we look at abusers, strangulation is a very personal, very terrifying crime. And just that somebody, there's been a lot of actually documentation. This is a whole kind of a whole nother so another trainings we can have, like we've identified 7 trainings we can do so far in this hour and a half, but about the ways in which many when we think about mass shooters being defined as people who kill 3 or more people in a single incident, over 50% of mass shootings have some connection to domestic violence and very much a strangulation history in the past. So if somebody has been strangled, we should always be asking about if their partner has access to a gun. We know that most people who are strangled, people are strangled to death, but it's often that they're strangled and then murdered by a gun, which is the by far the most widely most more women die from gunshots in domestic violence than any other I'm blanking on the word, but any other mechanism of killing somebody. When we talk about recovery from the head injuries, there's really no timeline, and it's really affected by various factors. What is our response right after the injury? Was it identified? Was it treated immediately? Was it addressed? Were people able to rest? Talking about repeated concussions and other bodily injuries make it harder. What we think about, one of the things Rebecca talks about is, just like any other body part, if we are hurt and then we're hurt again and then we're hurt again and then we're hurt again, it does not give time for our body to heal. So one of the worst things that can happen to a person is if they are injured, they have a brain injury, is for it to get injured again before it has fully healed. It's also really, really hard to heal, because when we look at a lot of what really helps brain injury, there are brain injury recommendations that say, this is why we really need a whole separate area of brain injury, that are things about things like avoid stress. I mean, it will literally say that in its kind of in these guidelines for healing from brain injury, and kind of don't do activities if your symptoms come back. That's often really not realistic at all. But if people are having other psychological factors, general life stress, we know women tend to have extended recovery time, so we have a lot less information about women in brain injury, because so much of the brain injury has come from the military and has also come from the NFL and sports, which are heavily male populations. Just even understanding sex differences, and women have, our heads, necks are differences, our bone structures are different, our hormones are different. That research is very new. But we know, one of the things to know about it, it is very, very individualized. So the body and brain responses are so individualized. And we have these immediate symptoms that are right after the injury. We have brain injury symptoms. We have trauma-related symptoms. Often something we also see are what's called secondary symptoms, where if people are able to rest, if people are able to heal, they end up feeling okay. But, once you go back to work, once you go back to, like, your headaches come back, your irritability comes back, kind of the secondary symptoms can be something that can be very, very hard to manage. And then the long-term impact that can last weeks, months, years, or forever. When working with this. And I did want to pull one more little piece of information about what's called post-concussive syndrome, which is a symptoms, which is kind of there's still a lot of lack of understanding about this, but it really is when symptoms persist for weeks and months after injuries. So most people, like I said, and we don't have a lot of good research on domestic violence victims who are living in the environment that they're living in. When we're looking at things like, for example, a high school athlete that is not dealing with any kind of major stressors, has an injury on the soccer field, is able to heal, is able to, take some time off school, rest, kind of recover, often within a month, they're much better. It shouldn't have any long-term symptoms. But there are times where this kind of difficulty thinking clearly and feeling slowed down and difficulty concentrating, and particularly problems remembering new information. We look at this list of post-concussive syndrome. It doesn't really have a cause. People kind of speculate that it could be part of the physical damage to the brain is what impacts this. And then again, there's the emotional reactions to the effect of brain injury, where what it can be is people are having a hard time remembering things and being able to do what they used to do. And that can get very frustrating. We see that post-concussive syndrome is more commonly reported by people struggling with life stress, PTSD, poor social support system, and mental health challenges. Does that sound like our people? I think it sounds like our people. And in the DSM-5, it's called major or mild neurocognitive disorder due to a TBI. But I just do wonder how much of what sometimes we see in shelters and we see in survivors is related to this whole kind of me healing from a brain injury in the context of trauma. I am going to pause for, well, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to pause for 1 second and see if we have any more questions. I know we are freaking 5 minutes away, and I'm hoping that Ashley, we might be able to maybe schedule another webinar at some point so we could talk more specifically about some of the tools developed by ODVN. And
Yeah.
have to talk about that. But just wanted to just kind of think about these tips for anyone with a head injury. What really helps. Sleep really helps. So if you have individuals who are coming into DV services and have had a recent head injury, sleep is a very, 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 very good thing. And kind of resting your brain. You should not be making major decisions about your life after you've had a concussion. We talk about avoiding screens, avoiding things that bring on symptoms or make symptoms worse, not work. Easing back into activities, moving your body, and avoiding other head trauma are some suggestions that can really help people. And I'm going to take a few questions, but I'm also going to do a new share, and I want to point you to some resources that have been developed by ODVN. I'm sorry, I think I'm sharing my screen right now, that are free for you to use and for you to look at, that hopefully we'll be able to schedule another webinar and talk more specifically about some of these resources. But if you go to odvn.org, you will see it says our work, and there's a little tab that says brain injury. You just click on that little tab and you will see this is our webpage. We have some copy of our video, some information for survivors who are struggling. What we have learned is many survivors who have been strangled struggle with wearing masks. Just that restriction of breathing can be very, very triggering and very, very frightening. So we have developed some resources for that. And then here's a bunch of different brain injury and educational materials that could be useful for you. So I encourage you to look at those. And everything is on here is free and you can download. So I wanted to see, Michael asked, avoiding screens or screams. It's screens, like iPad screens, phone screens. And I think that, one of the things I really want to make sure, we do not need to be telling people like, you can't have your screen because that's super bad for your brain. We have to be making sure that we are telling people deserve information. They also deserve to make their own decisions. So I did want to see if we have any more questions. I'm sure we
Yeah. So there's one that I think is really important to answer because, just hearing those stories and hearing about how they kind of were screaming for help and weren't able to get it. So how can domestic violence professionals, make or get the medical professionals to take this seriously? How can, what can they say? What can an advocate say to a doctor to say, hey, I think you need to, do a brain scan or do whatever you need to do?
Well, and I think if any of you figure that out, will you please let me know? Because I don't know what I'm doing over here if you can get that figured out. No, and I think that this is one of those things that really requires increased collaboration with medical professionals. You will see that we have had some success. I'm going to click on one of these tools right here. We do have a head injury education card that we developed, and you will see it's just a very quick card that talks about, has your head been hurt? Has your partner kind of some of these things? Are you having physical problems? Are you having trouble doing some of these things? And then on the back, it has some of those danger signs, kind of red flags for brain injury. We have had some programs that have actually taken this thing and circled all of their symptoms and taken it with them to the doctor and said, I have just recently been hit in the head, and this is what I'm experiencing. And I wonder if that could be something to do with my head. Doctors have very, very little training on this. Like I said, I didn't know about this till a few years ago. But maybe one of the other things that we can do is, we can see if we can schedule a follow-up for this and talk about some of the other tools more in depth. But I think it's one of those things. Please share kind of that video that we're working with. But I also think a part of it is getting domestic violence victims. Well, it is getting the medical field kind of on board. What I will tell you why it is so important that we need to talk to domestic violence victims about this is because domestic violence victims think a couple of things about themselves. They think they're stupid and they think they're crazy. and they think that whatever they're struggling with and what is going on with them is their fault. And it's something that, and they, of course, they think they're stupid and they're crazy because their partners have called them stupid and crazy. And then when they go try to get help from someone, they're treated like they're crazy everywhere. And again, thinking about, I mean, I like to, my analogy that I like to use is when you have a broken leg, your leg is broken, right? You don't think, well, why is it so hard for me to run? Why can't I do stairs? What's wrong with me? Like, of course you can't do stairs. Your brain is broken. Your leg's broken, Like, it doesn't work as well. You can't do the things the same way you used to. Sharing some of this information, we're not telling people necessarily they have brain injuries. That would be something that a doctor would do, but really thinking about saying, did you know that when your head is impacted, it can impact all of these areas of your life? And we have found that to be incredibly empowering and incredibly relieving to domestic violence survivors, to take away some of that shame, blame, and guilt. So I think that putting some of this information, providing some of those resources, that we can have another kind of session to talk about those resources and how to use them and what they say, and how to have these conversations with survivors and provide this information. That is absolutely critical. And giving that information is power for survivors.
Absolutely. Well, that's very helpful. I do want to just wrap up and share, or ask you, are we able to share the slides with participants? I know that there may be some restrictions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, I will make sure that I get that to you. I'm going to put my contact information up here. And maybe Ashley and I will talk about scheduling, another specific, or I can even figure out if I need to do it through my agency or something, like something specific about the tools that we have
Yes.
developed here. It's a lot to try to do in an hour and a half.
Yeah, and also everyone that attends for, at any amount of time will receive a survey. So we'll make sure that, if there's any outstanding questions that you have that you'd like to see in a future webinar, specific to TBI and all of that, please do mention that in the survey. That way we can.
Want me back. No, I'm just kidding.
I think there's a general consensus that this was some really great information and that people want more. So we'll definitely have some conversations about how we can make that happen. So yeah, well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Rachel. This has been really informative.
Thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing. Thank you for spending an hour and a half on Zoom. I know Zoom can get a little old, so I appreciate every time anybody's willing to spend a little bit of time on it. That's my email address. Please feel free to follow up with me and contact me. I look forward to hopefully someday when we're back at conferences and stuff running into you all. So thank you all for the work that you do. And thank you to Domestic Shelters for the amazing resources that you also provide for survivors and for people who work in domestic violence.
Of course. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Take care, everybody. Right, I'm going to. Ashley, I am still here. I don't know if you were still here. So I'm still here if anybody still wants to talk to me. I think I'm still the host and I'm just trying to make sure I don't mess anything up. So if anybody wants to pop in with any other questions, I'm still here. But I'm sure if I close this out, I think Ashley made me. I'm gonna see if Ashley's still on here. Give me 1 second. You all will see how I talk to myself after I have these trainings. I just don't want to like X anything out when I'm there. Okay. So yes, I'm supposed to, all right. I'm going to X out of this. Thank you everybody who's still here. Oh, Ashley, you're still on here. Ashley, am I okay just to exit out? Okay. I'm just going to exit it out because I'm hoping that's okay with Ashley. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye.